Hello everyone. Today I'll be talking about risk management and aeronautical decision making, or ADM. So this is one of the most important areas in flight instruction because students are not only learning how to control the airplane but also how to make safe decisions. As an instructor, I believe our job is not just to teach flying skills, but to help students develop good judgment that they can use in real flight situations. All right, let's get started. And yeah, this slide explains why this topic matters so much. A large percentage of aviation accidents involve human factors, and many of them happen during takeoff and landing. And in many cases, the airplane itself is not the main problem. The problem is often a poor decision made before or during the flight. The good news is that these kinds of accidents are often preventable, and that is why risk management in ADM are so important. They give pilots a way to think more clearly and make safer decisions. Right. And the main objective here is that the FAA wants instructors to teach students judgment, not just flying technique. So first, students need to understand the difference between a hazard, a risk, and a risk. And second, they need to learn how to use ADM models like 3P, PAVE, CARE, TEAM, and 5P. And third, as instructors, we need to integrate risk management into every lesson. So students start thinking this way from the beginning. Okay, cool. Hazard versus risk. So this slide introduces the basic idea of hazard and risk. A hazard is simply a source of danger. For example, a thunderstorm near your route is a hazard, or there's something on the runway is also the hazard. A risk is the possible outcome if that hazard affects the flight, such as structural damage, loss of control, or inability to continue safely. So if you decided to go in IMC, even if you're not proficient in flying in it, it would be the risk, okay? So the hazard and risk are related, but they are not the same thing. So as pilots, our goal is to eliminate hazards when possible and when we cannot eliminate them. We reduce the risk to an acceptable level, okay? Cool. This slide covers the 5 hazardous attitudes remembered by the acronym RAIIM. First resignation is when a pilot feels like there's nothing I can do. For example, a student might just give up during a difficult situation instead of trying to crack it. And anti-authority is don't tell me what to do. For example, just they don't follow the rule and ignoring procedures or checklists because they think it's unnecessary. And impulsivity is acting too quickly without thinking. For example, making a sudden decision without fully evaluating the situation. And invulnerability is the mindset, it won't happen to me. For example, the continuing a flight into bad weather, assuming nothing will go wrong. And last, macho is trying to prove something. For example, taking unnecessary risks to show confidence or skill. So each of these attitudes can lead to poor decision making. And as an instructor, I think it's important not just to identify these attitudes, but also to teach antidotes. Because the antidotes help students replace unsafe thinking with a safer and more disciplined mindset. And ADM, or aeronautical decision making, is a systematic approach to making sound decisions in flight. It helps pilots choose the best course of action based on the situation they're facing. So ADM is not about guessing or just going with instinct. It gives the structure to the decision-making process, and that is important because good judgment is not something students automatically have, and it's something that can be taught, practiced, and improved over time. Also, ADM is not only for emergencies, and it should be used during every phase of flight. Always active. Okay. And this one is the 3P process. So this slide explains the 3P process, which stands for perceive, process, and perform. It is a practical loop that pilots can usually continuously during the flight. So first, we perceive the hazard, and we do that using PAVE. So like identify the hazard by using PAVE, and then we process the situation using care, and finally we perform a decision using team. And the key point is that this is not a one-time checklist. It is a continuous cycle. So as conditions change, the pilot keeps running this loop to stay ahead of the situation. Okay. All right. So let's. Yes, and this slide is just the outline for the PAVE to perceive the hazard, which helps the pilots perceive the hazard. Okay, so we are gonna talk this more detail in the next slide here, but for now I just keep briefly explain. And so P stands for pilot, and this includes personal conditions, often checked with I'm safe, and also needs to bring those documents before flight. And A stands for aircraft, meaning the airplane's documents, inspections, and equipment. And V stands for environment, such as in weather, runway conditions, delays, terrain, and fuel planning. And Echo E stands for external pressures, which can include the schedule pressure, passenger expectations, or the desire to complete the flight, no matter what. And yeah, well, I think external pressure is especially important because many unsafe decisions come from pressure that has nothing to do with safe flight. Okay. All right, let's dig in the PAVE. So this slide goes into more detail on each PAVE category. So starting with the pilot, P. I'm safe is a reminder that risk assessment starts with a person flying the airplane. That includes illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. And when it comes to alcohol here, just because a pilot is below the legal BAC limit, 0.04%, that doesn't automatically mean it's safe to fly. So this is a good example of how being legal and being safe are not always the same thing, right? So even if the airplane is fully airworthy and the weather looks acceptable, the flight can still become unsafe if the pilot is not physically or mentally fit to fly, okay? So I'm safe is really about being honest with yourself before and during the flight. Also, don't forget to bring the necessary items before flight, which are the pilot certificate, medical certificate, and government issued photo ID. A logbook is not necessary item, but you should bring it before flight just in case. Okay. And next is aircraft. For the aircraft, I would break it down using DI. So documents, inspections, and equipment. And first, okay, let's start with D, stands for documents. And here I use Sparrow. That includes supplements such as STC, supplement type certificate, which is just you change something, but it's not enough to get the new type certificate, and you can use the supplement type certificates. So yeah, so if the aircraft has modified equipment, right? So I need to make sure the required supplement is available and current. And play cards, these provide operating limitations or required information directly in the cockpit. So if play card is, it's kind of sticker, like, and if a play card is missing, that could mean the aircraft is not legal to operate as configured. Okay. And airworthiness certificate, this must be on board and visible to passengers. So it shows that the aircraft has been certificated as airworthy. And registration, the aircraft must have a valid registration on board. So without it, the airplane is not legal to operate. And radio license, this usually matters for international operations, but it's still part of the document review. And operating limitations, usually found in POH or FAA approved flight manual. This is important because the pilot must know the approved limitations and procedures for the aircraft. Last, weight and balance. It's not just having the information, but making sure that the aircraft is actually loaded within limits for that flight. So overall, the document portion is about confirming that the aircraft has the required legal paperwork and approved operating information. And next, I stands for inspections. And here I use GA Aviate. So that includes GPS database. If the flight depends on GPS navigation, especially IFR, the database needs to be current as required for the operation. And ADs, which is airworthiness directives, these are legally enforceable corrections issued by the FAA. So I need to confirm that any applicable AD has been complied with. Okay. An annual inspection required every 12 calendar months for most aircraft. And viewer check required every 3 days for IFR operations if viewer equipment is being used. And 100-hour inspection required every 100 hours of operation if the aircraft is used for flight instruction for hire or carrying persons for hire. And altimeter and pitot-static. So altimeter and pitot-static system must be inspected every 24 calendar months for IFR operations, and transponder must also be inspected every 24 calendar months if operating in transponder required airspace. And last, ELT must be inspected, just to remember 1 to 1.5, so every 12 calendar months, and the battery must be replaced or recharged after 1 hour of cumulative use or when 50% of its usable life has expired. Okay. So this inspection part is about making sure the aircraft is not only physically available but actually current and legal for the kind of flight I'm about to conduct. Okay. And finally, this is important. So finally, E stands for equipment. And what it means, if I have inoperative equipment, I would follow a structured process to determine whether the aircraft is still airworthy. And first, I would check if the aircraft has an MEL, which is minimum equipment list. If an MEL is available, I would follow the MEL procedures because it provides a specific guidance on what can be inoperative and under what conditions. But if there's no MEL, which is common for most general aviation aircraft, so I would follow the process outlined in 91-213. First, I would check if the equipment is required. To do that, I would look at 4 things. First is 91-205, which is like atomated flames and flaps. And this regulation tells me the minimum required instruments and equipment based on the type of operation, such as VFR day, VFR night, or IFR. So here I'm specifically looking at whether that piece of equipment is legally required for the kind of flight I'm planning to conduct. And second is COIL, so kinds of operational equipment list in the POH, which tells me what equipment is required for specific operation. I can also reference the equipment list, like sometimes called the comprehensive equipment list on POH, to verify what equipment is actually installed in the aircraft. And the coil is aircraft specific, actually. So, and it tells me what equipment is required for different types of operations, right? So unlike 9125, which is general, and coil applies specifically to that aircraft. And here I would look at whether the equipment is required for that particular operation in that specific airplane. Okay. And now third is airworthiness directives, ADs. These are legally enforceable rules issued by the FAA to correct unsafe conditions. So I would check if there's an AD that requires that specific equipment to be installed and operational. If an AD applies, then the equipment must be functional for the aircraft to be airworthy. And fourth is the type certificate data sheet, or TCDS. So this defines how the aircraft was originally certified, including required equipment and limitations. So here, I'm checking whether that equipment is part of the aircraft's approved configuration. So overall, 9125 is general regulatory requirements, and COIL is the aircraft specific requirements, and ADs are mandatory safety corrections, and TCDS defines the certified configuration of the aircraft. So if the equipment is required by any of these, then it must be operational for the aircraft to be airworthy, unless it's allowed by an MEL. If the equipment is not required, then I would move to the next step. So I would deactivate or remove the inoperative equipment and play carded it as inoperative. So and make a proper logbook entry if required. And depending on the situation, this may involve both pilot and certified mechanic. Then after that, I make the final decision as the PIC whether the aircraft is safe for the intended flight. So, overall, this process ensures that I'm not just guessing, but making a legal and safety-based decision. Okay, cool. Then we have environment. This includes things like NOTAMs, weather, non-traffic delays, runway lengths, alternate, fuel, and takeoff and landing distances or performance. And this is important because many flight risks come from the surrounding conditions, not just airplane itself, right? And finally, external pressure. Get there, that's sure. So this is often one of the most dangerous parts, and because it may not seem aviation related at first, and it could be a desire to stay on schedule, pressure from passengers, a student wanting just to complete the lesson, or simply the mindset of wanting to get there no matter what. The problem is that external pressure can quietly push a pilot toward a poor decision, even when they already know the safer choice. So the value of PAVE is that it forces the pilot to step back and look at the whole picture. So like the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and the outside pressures influencing the decision. And I think that's what makes PAVE so useful to identify the hazard, to perceive the hazard. And because it helps prevent the pilot from becoming too focused on just one part of the flight and while missing the bigger risk picture. Okay, cool. Here's a cater. So after identifying hazards, the next step is to process them using care. So C stands for consequences, like what could happen if I do not manage this risk properly. And alpha, A, stands for alternatives. So what other options do I have right now? And R, reality. And am I looking at this situation clearly, or am I minimizing the danger? Something like this. And E stands for external pressures. It's something like outside the cockpit, pushing me toward the wrong choice, something like this. So care is useful because it slows the pilot down and encourages more honest thinking before acting. Okay. And once the pilot understands the risk, team helps decide what actions to take. So T stands for transfer, which means shifting some of the risk, such as asking ATC for help or sharing tasks with another pilot. And E stands for eliminate, which means removing the hazard completely. So maybe by delaying, diverting, or canceling the flight. Okay, pretty normal. And A stands for accept. So, which means recognizing a manageable risk and continuing with full awareness. Okay. So, yeah, do not use accepting much. Just this one, if you cannot evade the risk ahead, then you can accept by full situational awareness all the time. And M stands for mitigate, which means reducing the risk, even if it cannot be removed completely, right? So, overall, care helps us understand. Care helps us understand the problem, and team helps us decide what to do about it. Okay, so there's a difference. This slide introduces the 5P model, which is especially useful for longer flights. So the 5Ps are plane, pilot, passengers, programming. This model reminds the pilot to regularly reassess the situation as the flight continues. And for example, maybe the original plan no longer makes sense, or maybe the pilot is becoming fatigued, or maybe the passengers are creating pressure. And programming is also important today because automation can help us, but it can also create confusion if we are not managing it properly. Okay. And this slide shows when to use the 5P check. So, it can be done during pre-flight, pre-takeoff, around the midpoint of the flight, before descent, and before final approach or landing. I think this is very useful habit because conditions can change a lot during a flight. So if the pilot only thinks about risk once at the beginning, they may miss developing problems later on. So the 5P check works like a risk reset and helps the pilot stay proactive instead of reactive. Great. Situational awareness means more than just seeing what is happening right now. So it also means understanding what it means and anticipating what may happen next. So it is not just observation, it's awareness plus interpretation. A pilot with good situational awareness is able to stay mentally ahead of the airplane, traffic, weather, and workload. So this is a major part of safe flying, especially in busy or changing conditions. And this slide explains some common ways pilots lose situational awareness. So fatigue can reduce the scan quality and slow thinking. And distraction can break the pilot's mental picture, even from something small like a radio call or passenger caution. And complacency can be dangerous because routine flights may feel easy, right? Which can make the pilots less alert. As an instructor, I think it's important to remind the students that losing situational awareness usually happens gradually, not all at once. CFIT. This slide talks about controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. This happens when an airworthy aircraft under the pilot's control is unintentionally flown into terrain, water, or an obstacle. This often happens because of poor visibility, weather, fatigue, disorientation, or loss of situational awareness. So that's why understanding weather, maintaining awareness, and correctly interpreting procedures are so important. And CFIT is a strong reminder that being in control of the airplane is not enough if the pilot is not fully aware of the environment. Okay. And this slide compares SRM, single resource management, and crew resource management. So SRM stands for single pilot resource management, and the main idea in both is using all available resources effectively to make safe decisions. In a multi-crew environment, that includes other crew members. In single pilot operations, that means using tools like checklists and automation, ATC, weather information, and good personal decision making. So SRM is basically the single pilot version of CRM. Built on the same safety principles, right? So use anything, all the available resources you can use. If you have crew, it'll be crew resource management. Okay. So, and this slide connects everything to the instructor's role. So risk management should not be treated like a separate lesson that is taught once and then forgotten. And it should be built into normal flight training from the beginning. So the goal is not just to create pilots who can follow steps, but pilots who can think clearly and make safe choices on their own. And that is what makes someone a safer and more independent pilot. And this slide explains how instructors can actually teach risk management during training. First, we can make it part of every briefing by asking questions like, what is the biggest hazard today? And second, we can use real scenarios or accident cases because they make the lesson more meaningful. And third, we should teach thinking, not just answers. So instead of immediately telling the student what to do, we can ask what they would do and why. And that way, the student practices the decision-making process, not just memorizing the instructor's answer. Cool. And this slide gives a practical example. And actually, if there's student really wants to fly in the bad weather, that time, this is very great opportunity to teach them about ADM concepts rather than going flight, right? So first, identify the hazard, such as low ceilings, poor visibility, or possible IMC by using PAVE. Okay, and then evaluate the risk using care. And what are the consequences and what alternatives do we have? We'll keep reminding in reality and also want to check my students' external pressure. Go. And finally, guide the students through the decision using team. So if we can't transfer the risk, then eliminate, right? But we could transfer the flight to the ground lesson, which is great too. So the important part is helping the student arrive at the right decision through reasoning and not just saying no without explanation. Great. Key takeaways. So to conclude, risk is always present in aviation, and the goal is not to remove all risk completely, because that is impossible. And the goal is to recognize it, assess it, and manage it properly. Hazard attitudes matter because attitude shapes decision making. And models like 3P, PAVE, CARE, TEAM, and 5P are useful because they give structure to our thinking. And ultimately, good ADM helps prevent accidents. And the safest pilots are not the ones who never face difficult situations, but the ones who make better decisions when they do. So with that, we've covered all the FOI tasks from A through F in the ACS. Cool. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much.